Good morning, Dr. Earp. How are you?
Good morning. All things considered, I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good, thanks. And congratulations on the title as well. Richly deserved. Although, from my amateur understanding of your output, it looks like you've done 5 or 6 full academic careers before you got your PhD.
Well, I have been getting emails addressed to Dear Dr. Earp for several years now. And so I always wonder, am I supposed to correct the person and let them know? And then
yeah,
now at least I don't have that particular decision to make. So I guess
exactly.
that's
You've just
one good
closed
outcome.
you just closed the gap for them. So, well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining this series of Sentientist Conversations. And as we've talked about briefly, it focuses on what I think are the two deepest and most important philosophical questions: what's real? How should we understand the world? And what matters morally? What should the basis for our morality be? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and build some community around a very simple view of this worldview I'm calling sentientism, not a term I invented, but I'm sort of recasting it as when it comes to thinking about what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason, as opposed to a supernatural approach. And when it comes to morality, we should grant moral consideration for all beings that have sentience, or we think have sentience, a capacity to experience suffering, flourishing. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree and disagree with that worldview. So it'll be fascinating to understand your sort of personal philosophical journey. And so much of your work, of course, fits into, I guess, science, how we understand reality, the problems and challenges of that, but also how that flows through or doesn't flow through to, many contentious aspects of modern ethics as well. So yeah, it's great to have the chance to talk to you.
Yeah, those are some deep and interesting questions. I'm glad
Yeah,
we'll get to dig into them.
we'll see where we get to in an hour. So before we hit those two deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know you already?
Well, I don't know. I have an academic background in philosophy and cognitive science, and lately I've been focusing on practical and applied ethics. So I guess that touches on some of what you're talking about, is trying to figure out how to go beyond just trying to describe the world, say, build models that are explanatorily robust and accurate as to what's going on out there, but also to say, how should the world be? What are some aspects of the world that you can raise normative moral arguments to try to convince people that things should be different? And so I guess I exist in the margins between these two kinds of enterprises: a scientific descriptive enterprise, some of which has to do with understanding how the mind works, including the mind making moral judgments, and then also a normative prescriptive program where I try to make moral arguments.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, we'll delve into that a little bit. So the first of those two crazily broad, but I think foundational questions is what's real? And there's so many different ways of answering that question, but many of my guests talk about whether they grew up in maybe a supernatural, mystical, spiritual, religious worldview in their family and society, or one that was more naturalistic or scientific based in some sense, and how that way of thinking about epistemology, I guess, what's real has changed over their life if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it would be fascinating to know your own journey on that front.
Sure. So I grew up in Seattle, which is a sort of, not deep in the Bible Belt or anything like that, but
Mm,
nevertheless, the local community within which I was raised was a form of evangelical Christianity.
mm,
Free Methodism was the particular governing principle of our church. And with respect to my exposure to supernatural ideas and scientific ideas, I guess I had some of both. I mean, my mom was really holding the center of gravity in terms of Christianity and teaching us about God and having these particular kinds of religious notions instilled within us.
mm.
We all went to church together, and my dad went to church and sang in the choir and so forth. But at some time around I don't know, maybe the time I was 16 or so, I got the impression, at least, that my dad didn't have a very strong religious conviction necessarily, but was more trying to, raise the kids in collaboration with my mom according to her beliefs. And he's always been interested in science and chemistry and biology and, understanding the world from a natural perspective. And I think he was, congenial to evolution as an explanatory framework. Whereas from my mom's perspective, evolution was something that was really, might tempt us away from the path of righteousness if we were to get too caught up in those ideas. So
Yeah.
I suppose I was exposed to different worldviews, but mostly growing up, I would say I felt that I was trying to adhere to these religious precepts. And I won't say that I passively accepted them, but somewhat unthinkingly at first. And it wasn't until maybe I was 11 or 12 when I remember asking a lot of questions of maybe the youth pastor at church, and just, really simple stuff like, well, if you only get to go to heaven if you accept Jesus into your heart, then what about people who've never heard of Jesus and the Amazon or something? It doesn't seem fair if they shouldn't get to go to heaven. How do you deal with that? So I was asking questions along those lines. I've always been troubled by what philosophically is formally described as the problem of evil, but just basically, I'm very emotionally acutely sensitive to suffering and pain of others and myself. I'm also pain averse. I like to think, how can there be less suffering in the world? And I did have a hard time from a philosophical perspective reconciling the magnitude and the seeming arbitrariness of a lot of pain and suffering in the world, undeserved pain and suffering, with this image of God as an omnibenevolent, all-knowing, all-powerful kind of creature. So that was probably one of the main things that caused me to adopt an attitude of maybe greater skepticism towards some of what I had been raised with. The concern with figuring out what's right and wrong, how should we live, and not just everything goes, was a major theme of my childhood. And one thing that I think I take away from maybe my mom's perspective in particular was a very serious concern with morality. So, I mean, she builds, at least explicitly, her view around something like divine command theory, I guess, which gives a certain weight to ideas. Things are right and wrong because God says they're right and wrong, and if you structure your worldview around those ideas, that can be a strong motivation. I'm less convinced that the basis of morality is God's will, but I do think that moral questions are very important, and I've always thought they were important since I was a kid. I wanted to figure out, how should we be? So that's something I certainly feel that I've preserved from that aspect of my upbringing. It's probably fair to describe me as sort of agnostic when it comes to the really metaphysical questions about. I mean, once you ask, what do you think, does God exist? I think, well, I don't know. What do you mean by God? I don't know what you're referring to. I think it's easier for me to say I'm not sure, because one, I don't know when people are formulating these questions, what concept they're invoking. And second of all, I think the burden of proof is on the person who expresses confidence in their view. So if somebody says, I know that Jesus died for my sins, and I know that God has all this stuff, I was thinking, wow, how are you confident about that? Like, I find myself puzzled by many phenomena just within the stuff that I have a reasonable grasp on. And so the idea of extreme confidence about the nature of the universe and all this other stuff is always very impressive to me, that some people feel so strongly that they know what's going on at the greatest levels of abstraction, or maybe they feel they have a very personal relationship with God. Maybe that's how some people do.
Yeah.
So anyway, I could go on and on, but
that's fascinating, and it's interesting because with many of my guests have followed a similar sort of journey. So I grew up Christian myself, and became, I guess, an atheist, or quite an extreme agnostic, if you like. But not all of my guests have. So some of them, maintain some sort of religious or supernatural, or maybe spiritual, but not religious worldview. But for those who've gone down the more naturalistic route, it seems that some were driven more by a sort of intellectual fact, evidence, and reason approach. This doesn't feel like it stacks up. I don't see the evidence. There's inconsistencies in the fact I'm being told. Oh, look at these other religions. There's even more inconsistencies. How can they all be right? So it's more of a technical evidence and reason thing. Whereas for other people, it's more questions of on the morality side and on the ethics side that, as you mentioned, that your two first examples was questioning, okay, hell doesn't sound that compassionate, and and the constraints that there's very real compassion in many religious worldviews, but then constraints and conditionality are put on it. So the first two examples you picked out were more ethics than evidence and reasons. Would you say that was the main reason you started to question it, or was there also a sort of logic, evidence, reason, fact-based stuff as well?
Well, it was a cluster of those things. I mean, I started studying philosophy when I was in college, and I did appreciate the freedom to be able to pursue any kind of question and test ideas at their limits and try to figure out what would count as evidence for certain types of claims. And I was interested in metaphysics and philosophy of religion and those kinds of things. There was a key moment in my life. I remember standing on the porch when I was going to go off to Yale for my undergraduate degree. And this was a matter of contention in my family because, as I recall, my mom in particular wanted me to consider going to a Bible college to, not be tempted away. by a liberal institution that was, secular at its core. And I get the reasoning. If you think that your child's having certain beliefs is the precondition for having an eternity of joy versus an eternity of suffering, basically it would be completely negligent of you as a parent to do anything short of your best to ensure that they come away with the
it's pretty rational and ethical based on those beliefs, right? Yeah,
exactly. And so I appreciate the sincerity of my mom's view, and who knows, maybe she's right. But what I said to her was, one thing that you can rest assured in is that I really care about figuring out what's true. I'm not just indifferent to it. I'm constantly asking questions about how is the universe organized, and how shall we live, and what would count as reasons for certain types of views and what would count as reasons against them. So this is something I really pursue. Another thing is, in your worldview, God gives us certain kinds of gifts. And if I have any gifts, I don't know, I can sing, that's something I can do, but also, I can think for myself. That's something that's particular to my way of approaching ideas. I'm very resistant to being strong-armed into being told I'm supposed to think one thing versus another. And so, if God gave me this gift of inquiry and a passion for seeking out what's true, and for not deluding myself or deceiving myself or pretending that I believe certain things, then you should have faith that if your set of ideas are the true ones, then there's a decent chance that I'll get there just through being honest with myself and pursuing these questions deeply. So I spent a long time studying various histories of early scripture, and debates about which were the authentic documents, and studying philosophy of religion and so forth. I really threw myself into these questions. And so part of what came out of that was that I thought that a lot of at least the fundamentalist precepts about the earth is a few thousand years old, and Noah really had an ark and so forth, I started to think that those ideas just can't be true. I don't understand what's going on in like string theory and modern physics. So if you have an abstract conception of God as some sort of idea that you can describe mathematically or something like that, I'm not in a position to even evaluate those ideas. So sure, maybe, but the sort of simplistic picture of God is something like the man in the cloud. Certainly just didn't hold up over time. Yeah. And a lot of the claims about the age of the earth and the attempted refutations of evolution by natural selection, that stuff just sort of fell apart once I started to study those things more seriously in college. But also, I think I started to have ethical concerns with many precepts of at least the version of Christianity with which I was familiar, which was, homophobic was one. You have a moral response to the world, and then you go look up whatever the doctrine is of your religious teachings, and you think, well, something's got to give here. Yeah. Either my moral sense that like certain things are wrong has to go, or I have to come to the conclusion that perhaps these precepts are flawed, or they're the best attempt of people a few thousand years ago to try to get their moral priorities straight, and maybe they got some things wrong. I also think if you think of the Bible and other scriptures as basically human beings' attempt to grasp at or make sense of something beyond their ken, some sort of divinity, you can appreciate that all these different religious traditions are human traditions, and you don't have to rule out the possibility that they're trying to get at something that really exists that goes beyond whatever we want to describe as the natural world, but in their flawed, faltering way with all sorts of contradictions and so forth. And, I'd be happy if that were so. And, I also started to think of, well, if I'd been born in a different country, I probably would have had a different religion. And so it doesn't make sense for me to just think to myself, isn't it lucky that I happen to have been born into the part of the world, particular community in which I just happen to have been raised within the sort of correct religion. It's just that
pulled out the right lottery ticket, and
unless I have independent reason to adopt one view over another, and if I've studied different religions and considered the claims that they make on the world, then maybe I'd be in a position to adopt one sort of faith view over another. But I just so far I don't find the claims compelling. Certainly and it's a lot of it's moral claims. I think a lot of evil is done in the name of religion, sadly, and that's something that has stuck with me for many years.
Yeah, and this is one of the balances that we find in many of these conversations, because there is a genuine, rich compassion at the heart of most, maybe all religions in some sense. But I guess this is where we come on to the second challenge and the second question about what matters and what is our grounding of morality, because it seems that often a religious compassion, there's a few dangers that come through a supernatural worldview that can warp even a universal compassion. So one, as we've said, that compassion can be constrained or conditional, right? So there's compassion, but only for our in-group, not for those apostates or that other religion, or and it's conditional. If you follow the rules in the Bible or the Quran or whatever else, you get in, otherwise you burn in hell, right? So there's a constraint or conditionality on the compassion. There's often also a challenge around, okay, other people matter and we should have compassion for them, but actually there's something more important than that. And it might be obedience to a deity. It might be compliance with a set of rules. And that's not just religious either. You can have, a number of different sort of superordinate priorities, whether it's a blood and soil or a one nation state, or an all-powerful leader, or, the head of a cult, right? That they say, look, there's compassion here, but there's something that's even more important than the suffering and death of sentient beings, which can then excuse different problems. But
it depends on the level of analysis where you're pitching your argument, because imagine you have a judge who has like deep compassion for the alleged committer of a crime, and as a consequence fails to respond in a just manner to the circumstances before the judge. You can imagine situations where the use of compassion could be employed in such a way that it conflicts with other things where we may have at least approximate moral obligation to behave one way versus another. Concerns about fairness, for example, or justice or whatever. So it seems like what you're suggesting is that we should think of the grounding of our whole moral worldview, or maybe the ends of our moral action should be to reduce suffering and to be motivated to do so on the basis of compassion, which feels like a version of a kind of utilitarianism. It's a consequentialist view that we should, do those things that reduce suffering, and maybe cultivate compassion as a way of motivating ourselves to do those things, or something like that. And yeah, I mean, that's plausible to me. There's various paradoxes that spring up when you take utilitarian reasoning to its logical conclusions. And so maybe this is jumping ahead in the conversation, but when I try to think about what's the ultimate grounding of what makes one thing moral and another thing not, that's another thing I tend to be agnostic about. I tend to dive into the middle of a kind of web of beliefs and intuitions, and try to orient myself around things that I'm pretty darn sure about. And I'm pretty darn sure that, needless suffering of innocent persons is just the worst thing. That treating different people unequally when there's no relevant moral difference between them is just really bad. And then you can throw in some other things that you learn just through time and practice, that, certain traditions can create a sort of passive mindset whereby you're unable to see the suffering of certain groups because you're so used to it, for example. And so understanding something about psychology is helpful in, uncovering certain sources of pain and ill-being in the world that maybe aren't necessary. And then I just try to reason about particular cases from the guiding points that I can hold relatively constant. So it's something like a Quinean web of different commitments, where I have some things that are really at the core of my orientation toward things, which is, partly, again, just it has to do with my own disposition. I have a very strong kind of anti-violent tendency. I can't like watching violent films is very hard for me. Seeing people suffer just strikes me very powerfully in a way that maybe it doesn't everyone. And so that affects at least the weights that I assign to certain kinds of things. I'm also very just intuitively concerned for people who are disadvantaged in some way, who lack the power or agency or ability to make decisions in their own interests. And so a lot of my work concerns children and children's rights, and trying to make sure that children have a voice, because they aren't writing philosophy papers on their own behalf. So I feel sometimes maybe I can help present a view of in favor of their perspective. So it's like, I've taken a bunch of classes on metaethics and try to figure out, what should be the totalizing, comprehensive view, and then you derive your principles from that. And I sort of feel like there's different comprehensive metaethical views that you could adopt that are going to get you to, more or less the same mid-level principles that are the ones that we use to navigate most of our everyday moral life. So I guess it's the same way that I remain agnostic about what's going on in string theory vis-a-vis mathematical conceptions of God. With respect to the ultimate grounding of morality, I tend to think I'm not entirely sure, but there are some things I'm sure about, like needless suffering is to be avoided.
Yeah. No, I like that approach, because in the same ways you reflected that in your story about, I guess, moving towards a more naturalistic way of thinking, that didn't jump straight to a sort of dogmatic certainty about a series of facts that science has presented to you. You described it as being uncertain and not knowing, and having some humility and being open-minded in a sort of epistemological sense. So and I think you can take that approach. You can have you can have epistemological uncertainty and act with humility and withhold credence and belief until evidence is there. And I think you can apply a similar sort of style of thinking in a moral sense as well. You can be morally uncertain and be pluralistic and take a sort of toolbox approach that recognizes you've got some intuitions and weights and different perspectives that you can draw and to bring together. So yeah, I'm quite drawn to that approach.
Yeah. All right. So early on in our conversation, you said, part of the sentientist view is that we should adopt a naturalistic worldview, and then there were some other aspects of the view. And my thought is we should adopt a true worldview, whatever that is. So if the best reasons we have point to the view that the world is natural and not supernatural, I mean, we'd have to define what we mean by those distinctions. But then sure, we should be naturalists. If the best reasons we have point to the existence of some sort of supernatural sphere, whatever that might mean, then that's what we should believe. So on that view, my feeling is we should just believe whatever we have best reason to believe. The reason why I think I've, as a procedural matter, inclined myself toward always looking for naturalistic explanations to phenomena in the world is because once you avail yourself of it's that way because God wanted it that way, that might even be true, but it's not explanatory, and that's consistent with any state of affairs. So no matter which way things are in the world, you could kind of jury rig some solution according to which, well, that's just what God made it that way. And then it feels
you could almost insert anything into that place in the thinking and get the same result.
In the history of a lot of intellectual inquiry, trying to explain stuff, whatever. I mean, the cliche is like weather patterns, used to be attributed to the gods, and then you figure out more about how to explain that in naturalistic terms. And so there's a sort of shrinking explanatory gap that always gets filled with, God made it that way. And I sort of feel like, listen, that might be true. Maybe God made it that way. But I want to keep trying to use the tools that are available from an assumption of physicalism and an assumption of naturalism. And if you run into an ultimate roadblock where you just can't explain some phenomenon without invoking a deity, then God bless you. Go ahead with that. But I just don't think I've exhausted, and I don't think any of us have exhausted the explanatory project that's rooted in a sort of naturalist worldview.
No, I agree as well. And I'm probably being a little bit amateurishly fuzzy with my language as well, because there's clearly a sort of naturalism versus supernaturalism in what we understand the world to be, and a naturalistic stance there would say there is just the natural world, there is nothing supernatural. But the reason I talk about sentientism being evidence and reason is because I guess I'm more referring to that procedural naturalism, that methodological naturalism that says there might be supernatural stuff, who knows, I can be conceptually open to that, but until I have evidence of something, I won't grant credence to it. Now, some people link those two very strongly. So some people will say, well, look, I'm a methodological naturalist. I will use evidence and reason because what else is there, right? The only other thing is fabrication or revelation or arbitrary, unfounded belief. So we don't really have anything else in the toolbox, ultimately, apart from evidence and reasoning. So we have to be and they might say, if the evidence demonstrates there's something supernatural, then in a way it's no longer supernatural because we must have naturalistically gathered some evidence. So it becomes a little tautological, but I like the way you put it, and I think I share that view. Methodological naturalism I'm committed to because I don't think there's anything apart from evidence and reasoning that could give us reasonable basis for understanding things. But I'm not conceptually opposed to there being something supernatural or things we can't explain or can never explain or are just totally beyond our comprehension as moderately evolved apes. So you're right to remind us of needing that humility there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think so. I have a tendency, maybe it's I rely on this too much to try to think on the one hand and on the other hand. And well, what would a religious person say in response to this argument? So, I think somebody who's a deeply religious person who feels they have some sort of personal relationship with God on some conception might say, yeah, listen, I'm all about the evidence. And I have the evidence, for example, of a personal experience, which by my lights from the inside out can only be interpreted as, evidence of God speaking to me or something like that.
It's evidence.
So So yeah, we have this further question of, well, what counts as evidence? You and I might be inclined to come up with a naturalistic alternative explanation for that person's experience. We might say, well, you had blah blah blah, some brain event, and you interpreted it in such a way because you had some beliefs, and the beliefs inclined you to like disambiguate the ambiguous experience in favor of a view according to which it was like Jesus in your bedroom. And not having had such experiences myself, I tend to think that probably something like that is going on. But I think that a religious person would say, listen, I've got evidence for my view. I'm not, just believing this out of nowhere. And then we might have a disagreement about what counts as the right kind of evidence.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do think simplistically it breaks down that way. Right? So there are many religious people who will say, I reject the need for evidence and reason. I have a faith that is superordinate to evidence and reason. It's not relevant to me. I'm not interested in it. I have faith. That is the end. But there are many other people with religious and what I would call supernatural or unfounded beliefs who will say, no, I absolutely do have the evidence, and here's my reasoning. And I guess you can't draw a perfect line, because there is no perfect epistemology and decisions about what's right and what isn't right. We'll disagree based on our perspectives and the evidence we've seen, and we do different reasoning. So there's always going to be fuzzy areas outside of formal systems. There's always going to be fuzzy areas, and that's why I quite like a sort of more probabilistic approach to credence rather than belief. But at least with someone who has a supernatural view or religious view or maybe an unfounded conspiracy theory, if they tell you they are committed to methodological naturalism, at least you can have a conversation, and at least you can disagree over the quality of evidence, but at least there's some basis to work on. Whereas if someone has abandoned methodological naturalism, it's very hard to find any basis for rational conversation going forward. So I think when people naturalism doesn't mean everyone's going to agree, of course, right? And there are fuzzy areas around the edges too.
I agree with you that there are definitely two different kinds of conversations you can imagine having. One is with somebody who says, it's a precondition of any other thought that I might have that I hold to these religious premises, And so regardless of any evidence you might show me that contradicts what seems to follow from this premise, I'm just going to hold on to the premise. And then it's like, whoa, okay, so the kind of conversation we could have with each other is just going to be a bunch of foot stamping and talking past each other. We're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
But if somebody says, I hold these religious beliefs because I think I have best reason to hold them based on evidence, my own experience, the credences that I assign to different, bits of the world, and how I relate to those epistemologically, then, at least we can compare notes. I can say, okay, that's interesting. So you think that, you had an experience of whatever, and you interpreted it in such and so a way, and, I can see that, but couldn't you also interpret it this way? And now we're having a conversation, and I think I'm inclined to enjoy those conversations a bit more than the other kind.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think there's also there's a danger of dogmatism in a sort of religious or a supernatural worldview. There's a danger of dogmatism within a naturalistic worldview as well. And it sometimes is described as a sort of scientism, or you get this sense of, we've done the randomized controlled trial, there is the answer, it's over, right? And you can sometimes feel that tone coming through in some of the atheist or secular or rationalist movements as well. And they've forgotten that you need that humility as a central part of naturalism. You need.
Yeah, I read, all the new atheist books when I was 16 or something like that, and I was trying to figure out what to. And I think I had a phase where I needed the unbridled kind of anti-religious fervor of some of that writing to give me some momentum, maybe to really
kick you out of
something like that, perhaps. But over time I started to feel like I noticed what seemed to me like dogmatic thinking within some of those kinds of new atheist type appraisals of things. You can find dogmatism anywhere. Similarly, I grew up in a kind of a politically conservative community. And I associated that with, a certain kind of dogmatism, and God wants certain things to be that way, so that's the way they are. But, as is now common to point out, you can find dogmatism on the left as well. And so it's for me, it's, there's religious people who are dogmatic and religious people who don't seem dogmatic, who seem extremely humble and open-minded. Similarly, there are atheists who are dogmatic and atheists who are humble and open-minded. And for me, it's the dimension that I care about in terms of forming relationships with people is not so much, are you religious or aren't you? Are you an atheist or aren't you? Are you a conservative or are you a progressive? But rather, are you approaching things from an awareness of the limits of our ability to know certain kinds of things, and the need to be epistemically humble and morally humble, and and go from there. And you can find a range of views that meet those criteria.
Yeah, agree. And back to the morality question. So you described this sort of toolbox pluralistic approach, but you did talk about there being some elements that are core to that, including, needlessly causing suffering, for example. I guess the way I'm trying to frame this sentientism idea, it sometimes is quite strongly associated with utilitarianism, because Peter Singer was one of the people who used the term in the along with Richard Ryder, and sometimes in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But I've been trying to suggest that it shouldn't follow a utilitarian path. It should just be a criteria for granting moral consideration, so that you can grant moral consideration to all sentient beings under this suggestion, and yes, follow a utilitarian or a consequentialist path. But you could also have a deontological view that has a set of rules that talk about how we treat other sentient beings. You could have a virtue ethics rule that talks about kindness to all sentient beings. You could have a feminist care ethic that talks about care for sentient beings. So I slip sometimes because my own biases do edge back towards a sort of consequentialist view. But it's very interesting because the community we've been building around this sentientism idea, there are people in all of those different ethical systems and commitments to those systems, but they all agree that, every sentient being warrants moral consideration. And then we all disagree about, how to manage those trade-offs and so on. So while I have a sort of perspective that, I also try and take a pluralistic approach in terms of ethical systems, it does seem to me that ultimately everything sort of boils back down to the quality of experiences of an individual sentient being. Whereas other people, don't boil it back down to that core. That's where it ends for me, but it doesn't have to, I think. Yeah. But
yeah, so I think, I don't know, pretty much everybody thinks that, human beings who have the kind of experience that we have are deserve some sort of moral standing by virtue of our consciousness and our, I don't know, it depends on how you parse things out. Some people think it's important that you have a soul in order to have a certain kind of moral standing. It's like, okay, well, I don't know what to say about that. But the thought that like other entities with subjective experience who have things that are good for or bad for them vis-a-vis their experience, it seems like I sort of don't get the argument why you wouldn't grant moral standing to anything that can feel. Some people make a hierarchy of values where they say, well, we have complex consciousness that grounds certain kinds of things, where we have prospective desires that we project into the future and all this kind of stuff. And that gives us a special kind of moral standing. And like, okay, we can have a conversation about that. But I don't know, are there people who seriously deny moral standing to, like, I don't know, animals and other entities that feel?
And sadly there are, right? So I think there are people who will do that on a supernatural or religious basis. They will say animals don't have souls, or humans are made in the image of God. We've been given dominion, therefore, basically zero moral consideration for non-human animals. They're there for our purposes. So it's a sort of religious or a supernatural reification of the human and a separation of the human. But there are naturalistic versions of that as well. And you've hinted at one which is remarkably common even amongst public intellectuals today, where they will say, oh, it's the capacity for language, or it's the capacity for advanced self-reflection, or the ability to have, advanced sapient cognition or modeling of the future. And many people, I was just having a conversation with someone along those lines today, still, sit with that way of thinking. I think what's more common, and this is the second part of that morality question, and why I'm fascinated to hear your journey on this as well. More people in concept agree with this sort of sentiocentric moral consideration, right? So they'll say, of course, the puppy behind me, I have high degree of confidence that that puppy can experience joy and suffering and pleasure, and that has moral salient. And they'll, at least in concept, recognize that covers most of the animal kingdom. But then the problem comes with translating that into practice and the practical implications of that. And then, us humans are very good at applying arbitrary labels and categories to subsets of groups of entities, for self-serving ends because of the social norms we've grown up in. So, but that's one of the interesting things, because I sense from your work that you sort of follow my thinking, which is, well, common thinking, I guess Jeremy Bentham, but you can go much earlier than that as well, where people say, look, the reason we care about other humans really is because, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't. And morality in one sense is my decision to care about that. And based on the evidence we have, always incomplete. I can't be 100% sure you're sentient, but, I have a very high credence you are. But you can take the same logic that says, look, common evolutionary history, behavior and communications, looking at the information processing architecture that's going on inside your mind under an fMRI scanner. the inference that takes us away from solipsism and recognizing other humans are moral patients, you can do that across the animal world as well. And that choosing to stop at the human, an anthropocentric view, is just as arbitrary a stopping point as, thinking that only white people have moral consideration as well. I mean, it's just not a morally salient characteristic. How did you go through that journey? Because presumably that's not where you started, given the society you grew up with. And I'm interested in how you thought that through, but also, how did the practical implications of that play out in your life as well? Because there's often a lag there. There certainly was with me, where my ethics got to one point, but I didn't really act on that until quite a bit later.
Yeah. I mean, so a major point of change for me over the course of my adult life was my attitude toward eating meat. So probably, 10, 12, 13, 14 years ago, I was pretty convinced that eating meat was participating in a system that did a lot of harm to a lot of creatures that had moral standing, and I didn't really want to participate in that. And then I just kept eating meat for like another 10 years. So there was some point, and there's a psychological explanation for this, which is that I think deep within most of us is this cognitive heuristic, which is that if something is common within my social group, it's probably acceptable or positively good. And if you're a little baby growing up in a cultural environment where your survival depends on being able to adapt and quickly learn and absorb the norms of your group, it's probably a very fruitful heuristic to have. Just start with the assumption that if it's common, it's good. Yeah. And so it's kind of hard to undo that intuition through sheer thinking. I had convinced myself that you watch the documentaries and you read the books and you think, gosh, they really treat these animals horribly. And there's a different question we have, by the way, of is it okay to eat meat if the animal lives a happy life and is killed painlessly at the end of its life? We can talk about that in a minute, but let's just take how most meat comes to us, which is through these horrible, torturous methods.
Yeah.
You can reason through that you don't want to be a part of that. And then you look around and everybody's eating meat. And so it just triggers this deep kind of socially conditioned sense of, well, it can't be that bad. I mean, if everybody's doing it, how could it be wrong? It just doesn't intuitively feel like that could be so. So I think some of the worst and most intractable problems, morally speaking, have been things that are really bad, but also widespread in social norms. Yeah. Because then people just can't emotionally get leverage to try to dislodge the intuitive assumption that it can't be bad because everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was something that took me a long time. I mean, it was really arbitrary. It was like I'd had these views for a long time. I was like, yeah, one day maybe I should try to become a vegetarian or a vegan or something, but I don't know. Hamburgers taste good. And then I was with a friend and we watched, the umpteenth video of some sort of animal being tortured in a factory farm somewhere. And it just was like a switch. I just sort of thought, I don't want to be a part of this. And so I just stopped eating meat like that moment. And with very few exceptions, it just kind of continued. And that was several years ago now. So I don't know what happened. It was sort of an emotional switch. I think I was just shocked out of complacency or something like that. And I just didn't want to go back.
Yeah. I mean, it echoes with my journey on that front as well, because I think I thought this way for quite a while and did end up going vegetarian when I was, my early mid-20s, partly because my sister was vegetarian then. So, there was always that sort of reminder and that trigger to, just not to deny the topic and to think it through. So I went vegetarian at that point. But looking back imperfectly, because it was a while ago now, it felt like even that decision was socially framed as well, because my ethics then, I don't think were that different now. I've learned a lot. But the reason I went vegetarian and not vegan was really based on how normal it felt. So at that point, going back 25 years now, vegetarian felt a bit weird, but vegan felt like super weird. So I almost deliberately configured it. It was an ethically driven decision, but it was constrained by how weird I'd feel. I mean, it seems odd to say now, right? So I was been vegan for about 4 years now, again, partly by learning about dairy and eggs and all the other stuff that goes on as well. But it was, again, exactly that dynamic of, on the one hand, there's this sort of theoretical, rational, ethical line of thinking that leads you to a conclusion which actually is really bloody obvious. Well, that's just not how, social change happens or individual change happens.
This is why I think it's important and interesting to study psychology when you're interested in normative socio-political questions about moral change at the societal level, because yeah, it's one thing to get all your principles lined up, but it's another thing to, actually cause widespread change in normative practices. I think it's not hard to explain. It's like fundamentally we're social creatures. We are animals that evolved to function within, networks of dependency and interdependency, and monitoring each other's behavior and punishing defectors and so forth. And so we're all highly alert to what's seen as acceptable within our environment. And we're all deeply aware and intuitively aware that if we fail to act in the way that's expected within our group, that we may face social sanction. And that's just the worst thing. Isolation, being rejected by your group, ostracization, and so forth is like a death sentence for most of our history, and for many people still today. Yeah. And so, if you think you've got some good logical reasons as to why you shouldn't do something that most of your compatriots are doing, you're going to have, in addition to that, a kind of tolerance for being looked at strangely by people whose esteem you'd really like to have. And so you have to cultivate a certain sort of willingness to stand out or be seen as different or strange or something like that. And, there's a lot of incentives not to do that. So, it's not surprising that when moral revolutions happen is precisely when a view that had been fringe for a while starts to get a critical mass to where it's no longer so weird that to be a member of this dissenting group would cause you to be just, socially rejected. And then maybe it becomes even a badge of pride and you feel like you're a member of a cool minority group or something, but people
begrudgingly. Which is what vegans are now, of course.
Yeah, exactly. and that's why you see the ranks of veganism growing so rapidly. But for a long time, you're right, it was just like a freakish position and nobody wants to be a freak.
And one of the things I find fascinating is when you take any particular snapshot of, where an individual is in terms of their ethical stance and where a society is, the mix can be really interesting and often makes no logical sense, right? So you can have a position where someone is, in favor of restrictions on pet cruelty, but pro-animal farming. You can have someone who is against FGM, but pro-male circumcision, and another area you've done a great deal of work on. So whether it's human ethics or sentientist ethics, you can, at any snapshot point of time, you're not going to find a logically consistent, coherent set of ethics. It's really just going to be a sort of mishmash of different norms shifting over time and developing.
Yeah, I mean, we had a lab meeting in a cognitive science lab here at Yale some months ago, and we were trying to come up with an explanation for why people treat some animals like dogs and cats as not food and to be respected and cared for and treated compassionately, and other animals like pigs and cows and so forth as food, and with the assumption that they don't deserve quite as much consideration. And we kept coming with all these different theories. Maybe people think that dogs and cats are smarter than they think pigs are, regardless of what the truth is. Mm-hmm. Maybe people think X, Y, and Z. And we came to the conclusion at the end of this conversation that we were going about this wrong. It's not that people have a theory of animal intelligence or something, and then they derive from that their practices of how they should treat the animals. It's that we grow up in a culture where some animals are eaten and some are treated as pets.
Yeah.
And then our moral intuitions adapt to what we do. It was totally backwards to think that somehow people are like deciding how they're going to treat animals differently on the basis of some, folk theory of pig intelligence or something. It's like, that's not how it is.
That's not what's
happening. That we grow up from a young age, we do stuff, we learn that that's normal within our group, and then we're strongly disincentivized from questioning that unless we're forced to.
Yeah. And have you and Matty Wilkes managed to persuade Paul Bloom to go vegan yet after all of this work and all these conversations? Because it's a silly point, right? But one of my bugbears, I guess, is I try to be compassionate to people I disagree with as well, right? Partly by remembering my own self in past times, and partly by remembering that even vegans haven't achieved some ethical state of purity. There is no such thing, right? And I'm also recognized that you look around the world, 7.8 billion people, most of those people have got extremely urgent, pressing demands on their thinking, their time, their priorities, what they need to do, right? And someone like me has just the luxury of thinking this stuff through, and most people don't. So I try to understand and be understanding of where, the average person, or they exist, is on all of these different types of topics, whether it's, different forms of human ethics where I may disagree with them, or the big bugbear of animal farming, for example. Where I do struggle is where an individual is a public intellectual who might be a secular humanist, or they might be an atheist or a rationalist or a skeptic, whose entire ethos and worldview and presentation to the world is grounded in, I have risen above, the normality of human mess, and I have achieved a level of rationality and clarity of thinking that can cut through these questions, and I now have the answer, which can lead some people to, supreme overconfidence on atheism or supreme overconfidence on something else. But when you ask that individual, particularly about non-human animal ethics, it's like kryptonite. It's almost like even these supposed rationalists who are driving relentlessly with boldness to break down outdated, harmful social norms, to follow evidence, reason, and compassion to a brighter future. It's like the blinkers come back on. It's interesting. But it happens, I guess, on many topics where people have different blinkers for different topics. So that's my own bugbear. There's a frustration with the people who do have the time, the energy, the effort, and the focus on really clearly thinking these things through, still have their own sets of blinkers, even though they pretend they don't.
I think it reinforces the point we were making earlier, which is that we maybe arrive at some of our moral views through rational reflection, but in terms of our moral practice, a lot of other pieces have to be in place. We have to have adequate either just internal willpower or social support or structural affordances. That, I mean, you talked about veganism as a luxury that people have the time to think about their moral principles or whatever, but it's also literally a luxury. If you're in a food desert and all the food that's available to you is at McDonald's or whatever it is, and you've got $3 in your pocket and you've got to feed your family, being a vegan is literally a luxury that you can't afford.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, for most people, it's actually the cheaper and more accessible alternative. But there are absolutely people in those sort of food desert situations for which it's flipped the other way around. And most people have been mostly vegan for most of human life, right? Rice and beans is pretty effective. But I agree, right? There's situations that are different in terms of the practicalities, as well as just having the mental energy to think things through.
Yeah, but I mean, so just again, as somebody who was convinced of the arguments for failing to eat meat, but did so for another 10 years. I mean, I don't know what to say about people who, I certainly don't like people who posture and present themselves as like morally righteous or whatever, and then, fall short of their principles in really obvious ways. I mean, nobody likes hypocrisy. But we're all hypocrites. Like, I sure ain't morally perfect. I mean, I spend all day long. I'm an ethicist. It's a very interesting thing. Like, it says on my CV, like bioethicist. And so, okay, so
you must have all the answers.
Yeah, I'm like, you should do this, you should do that. And I try really hard to live a good life. I try to be a good person, and I am in some ways preoccupied with that concern. But there's just countless episodes of my life where I reflect on them and I go, that wasn't consistent with my values, or that's not how I would want to treat someone next time around. And so, that's unavoidable. So I don't know. It seems like you're trying to pick out people who like are really like grandstand about their moral righteousness or something, and then just like fall totally flat on obvious entailments of their own view or something like that. In which case, that's annoying for all the reasons.
Yeah, it's just moral self-righteousness
is annoying. Yeah.
But I think, that's one of the things I love about your work is that you deal with some really hard-hitting topics. You don't seem worried about challenging these deeply established social norms and values, but you treat the topics with compassion at the same time. You're not hectoring, you're not challenging. It's just clarity and uncertainty and trying to work things through. And I love the style. It's something I'd aspire to do in my own work. Listen, the snarkiness escapes.
I really appreciate that, but this was first of all, it's imperfect. I still sometimes get more agitated and animated in debates than I'd like to when I realize it's not fruitful and I'm just blowing off steam. But also when I first started writing, so, maybe what you're alluding to is that I write about circumcision, which is a common norm in the United States. It's not so common in England. But in my cultural milieu, people just take for granted that at birth, boys should have part of their penis removed as what they characterize as sort of a hygiene measure or something like that. I think there's really very strong reasons to like profoundly object to this practice. And when I first started writing about it, I wrote some blog posts at the Practical Ethics blog at Oxford like 12 years ago or something like that. And my first blog posts were extremely snarky. I mean, they're just like beset with eye rolling, and anybody who doesn't agree with this is obviously just indifferent to the suffering of children. And how could you mutilate people's genitals and stuff? And, I just, it just doesn't work. Like, what I realized was the people who already agreed with me were cheering, and the people who didn't agree with me completely dismissed my argument. So I thought, well, what's the point? If I actually think this is a moral issue, meaning that I really would like to see social change, then preaching to the choir is not helpful. I mean, I don't know, maybe it like rallies the troops or something like that. But, I feel this about a lot of things. I spend too much time on Twitter, and on Twitter, there's a lot of people strongly expressing certain moral views in a way where it seems like what they're doing is signaling to their friends that they have the correct moral views. But my feeling is, if you think this is a serious moral issue, you should be overwhelmingly concerned with persuading people who don't agree with you on the issue. Otherwise, you're not going to make any progress. But that would require a completely different way of framing the arguments. It would mean you frame the arguments in a way where you assume that your interlocutor is someone who's not a moron and not someone that you should just dismiss. It's not about dunking on people. It's about welcoming them into the conversation and seeing maybe where you have some shared principles or whatever. But for some reason, people who claim to really care about moral issues and seemingly would want to effectuate real change on those issues adopt a tone of voice and a means of arguing their point that can only alienate people who aren't already on their side. And I just fundamentally don't understand that.
Yeah. And I guess this has led into the final question, because I don't want to use too much of your time up, but about how do we think about the future and how can we make the world a better place? Because I think on, many of the issues you've written about and on the issue of animal advocacy as well, there's a similar pattern where through whatever luck, some people do manage to sort of step back, have a fresh think about, almost put the social norms to one side to the extent you can, think through the harms and the benefits and the suffering, maybe give a voice to the victims and empathize with the victims in that. And that often leads you directly to a point of stridency and assertiveness and moral hectoring. And that's completely understandable, right? We feel that partly because of our sense of compassion for the victims. And there are very obviously victims in many of these topics we've discussed. But then you have that difficult switch of recognizing that if you really want to help those victims, that mode of engagement, as you've said, is not, it's not effective with enough people, right? So how does that sort of weird balance leave you thinking about the best way of driving change, and how optimistic are you about driving change, positive change on the things we talked about?
And I don't want to overstate the point. Like, there's a lot of work coming out now in advocacy for racial justice, suggesting that there's like a role for anger in politics, and that sometimes a sort of genuinely well-grounded, righteous anger about injustice is something whose expression is both, important for the people expressing the anger, but also, can genuinely drive social change. So I don't want to oversimplify it. I mean, there's a difference between, a righteous expression of anger and, I guess, posturing on Twitter. So maybe that's the distinction that I was trying to get at. But imagine you open a gate and you go into somebody's backyard and you see that they're just like torturing a pig. You wouldn't be like, oh, that's, let me persuade this person in a gentle voice. You'd like freak out and you'd say, stop it. And I mean, hopefully you would. Hopefully you're
intervene.
So inflamed that you'd throw caution to the wind and try to stop it at whatever happens. But then if you open the door to like a factory farm and you see people torturing pigs, most of us are like, well, it's complicated. A lot of people eat pigs. And so I want to make sure I persuade the people who disagree with me. So I can sort of see the argument where somebody says, listen, if you have moral clarity about an issue, it's kind of strange that you're just like calmly and rationally trying to present an argument when you should be taking action. You should be hollering in the streets. You should be, showing your moral convictions through the intensity of your response. And so I get that. I'm not discounting that. I guess it depends on the issue. It depends on who your audience is. It depends on like what levers you can pull effectively to bring about change. Overall, what I found is that when it comes to really controversial issues where I know that there are reasonable people who, because of their particular story and background, disagree with me, or maybe I think ultimately they could come to agree with me, but they're just so used to the practice that it's hard for them to see it in a different way. I've just found that trying to bring them on board and treat them as a collaborator in a moral discourse is just infinitely better than hollering at them. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there aren't cases where, expression of anger is totally justified.
Yeah, no, I agree. Makes sense. And it's tricky to find that balance. It almost feels like, in some sense, as you get that moral clarity on a topic, you're giving up one form of cognitive dissonance because you're seeing something clearly and hopefully bringing your actions into line with, the way you see things. but sometimes you almost need to take on another form of deliberate cognitive dissonance to be able to campaign effectively and to engage effectively. And it is a really tricky balance between, on the one hand, moral hectoring and anger isn't always effective, but you could go too far the other way as well and forget the moral stance and end up appeasing or being too soft in a situation where urgency and anger and intervention is really called for. So, timeless challenge, both on human and non-human ethics, I guess. So, yeah. Well, I'm going to let you go, but thank you so much. It's been fascinating to talk to you. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, buying your book?
Oh, yeah, I have a book.
Yeah.
Buy it. It's great. I wrote a book.
The publisher will thank me.
The Chemical Future Relationships. And it's about like psychedelic relationship enhancement and the nature of love. I don't know, social.
And whether
ethics.
We should drip MDMA into the water supply to engender world peace.
Yes, I mean, it does consider ways in which these proposals could go wrong, and probably something like that would be a misfire. But yes, I mean, there's these emerging technologies that influence our neurochemistry in profound ways and affect our relationships. And right now, we're basically caught flat-footed as a society where we don't have a lot of procedural guidance as to how to do this, so it doesn't go off the rails. And so we're trying to open up a conversation about what we should do as the psychedelic renaissance is moving into mainstream medicine and affecting not just individual people and their symptoms of PTSD or whatever, but also people in their relationships. And that could either be to the good or it could be destructive if these technologies aren't handled carefully. So there's a book about it. It's really great. It's on Amazon. Please check it out. And we should have more conversations. There's clearly like many untouched things that we could discuss. So let's do this again sometime.
I would love to. Yeah, it'd be great to do a part 2. Thank you so much. Well, it's been a real pleasure. You deal with hard-hitting subjects with compassion and humility. So it's wonderful. I can't wait for you to deliver the next 6 full academic careers of output in the next 10 years.
Well, thank you. No, this is great to talk to you. And I really am left hungry for more. So I look forward to part 2.
That's great. Look forward to it. Take care. Thanks, Brian.